You know, something that I guess I am curious about, I keep hearing about the travel rule. I imagine that this will play into this a lot. I think that there's a lot of governments in particular that want to see a world where the idea of the anonymous wallet, it doesn't exist anymore. Could you talk to us a little bit about that and maybe share a little bit of just your personal feelings on that and then where you see things heading?
Sure. So, I mean, for the benefit of those who don't know what the travel rule is,
Yeah,
right?
please. Yeah.
The travel rule is basically a requirement introduced by the Financial Action Task Force in 2019 that is requiring crypto companies to implement a SWIFT equivalent kind of requirement. And what that means is that if you have two virtual asset service providers that are transacting with one another, whenever a transaction is being done, they need to share information about who the originator and beneficiary are, right? So let's say I'm exchange A, you're exchange B, and I have a client behind me that wants to send funds to one of your clients. Before that transaction can go through, I need to first communicate to you as an exchange that, hey, I have a client that wants to send funds to one of your clients, and you need to verify that the names match, right? That you indeed have a client by that name who's receiving these funds, and I need to provide you information about my client as well.
Right.
So just like the SWIFT, right?
How is it? Okay, so I have so many questions. How is it like SWIFT? So SWIFT, we've kind of all seen SWIFT. It's like you're making an international transfer. It's like SWIFT code.
Yes.
Right? So how does that work? I've never really thought about how SWIFT is working behind the scenes.
So what banks have to do is every time there's an interbank transfer, they need to share information about who the sender and receiver is as well, right? So that there is a way for law enforcement, right, to track where funds have been transferred, you know, even if they go from different organizations to different organizations. So it's an anti money laundering requirement, right? And they're trying to impose the same requirement on the crypto space, right? Because from a law enforcement and regulatory perspective, it's great. Now, you know, they can actually trace very clearly where crypto is coming from and where crypto is going. Now, the problem that the industry faces in trying to implement this is, unlike SWIFT, you know, with that requirement, we have the SWIFT Foundation that sets the standards, right, that everybody has to adhere to. But when FATF came up with the travel rule, there wasn't sufficient guidance as to who should lead this initiative. And what that ended up happening was to, you know, have, you know, half a dozen companies pop up overnight, all trying to solve the travel rule solution, but all taking a different approach to it, right? And as you can imagine, if travel rule requirement is for two companies to exchange information, and everybody's building different communication layers, it's not going to work. It's like if I'm using WhatsApp and you're using Telegram, we can't communicate.
Yeah.
Right? So because of that, the industry then suffered in trying to figure out, okay, you know, what's the one standard that everybody should adhere to? You know, whose protocol should we use, right? And obviously, you know, all companies are saying that theirs is the best.
Of course.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, thankfully, you know, it's been about 2 years since then. Industry has evolved, right? We're seeing more and more of these travel rule providers recognizing that for this solution to work, all travel rule protocols must be interoperable. Right. And so I'm happy to say that, you know, today we're seeing a very consolidated shift by all these travel providers wanting to work together, wanting their solutions to be interoperable, which is then great for the industry. But there are a lot of other problems. Right.
Tell me.
So one very good example is Singapore. You know, Singapore is great. We take our compliance very seriously. And so we're one of the first countries that introduced travel rule. That's great. But, you know, what happens if I'm an exchange in Singapore that requires travel rule and trying to do a transfer to you in a different country that doesn't yet have travel rule requirements? Does that mean that I can transfer funds to you? Because you're not going to adhere to it.
That's a good question. But then the other thing that I guess keeps coming to mind, but this is just between exchanges, right?
No.
Isn't it? No?
It's between all virtual asset service providers. And that's a very, very broad term.
But what about just a private wallet?
So this is where it gets interesting. So far, it doesn't apply to private wallets, which means that theoretically, if I'm a criminal that wants to evade travel rule, I'll send it from exchange to private wallet to exchange.
Of course.
And
I mean,
now,
it just seems so obvious, right?
Right.
So why? So with such a, you know, I mean, this is a loophole the size of a hula hoop, right? I mean, like, why even go down? Why even bother with this with such a obvious way to get around it?
So this is where I really have to give them a little bit credit, that where they didn't seek to over-regulate immediately, right? So I was actually fortunate enough in 2019 to be a part of a conference called the V20, where I pulled together virtual asset service providers and members of the FATF, and we actually had an opportunity to ask them this question, right? What are you doing about this obvious gap? And they said that they recognized the gap, but they didn't want to, close it until they studied how people were actually going to, take advantage of it.
Yeah.
Right. And thankfully, even at the 1 year later, they didn't yet close the gap, although they did heighten the risk of unhosted wallets.
Yeah.
Right. So in fact, there are exchanges today that don't allow customers to withdraw the unhosted wallets because they feel that, the risk of sending to an unhosted wallet where you can't really verify who owns it, who controls it.
Can you give an example of an exchange that?
Not off the top of my head.
Yeah, because I can't think of any.
Yeah,
Right?
they're not the ones that do very well.
I would
let's
imagine,
say.
right? Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, they're not the big ones for sure.
Yeah, wow, that would be interesting.
Because no crypto person will like that,
look
right?
into. I mean, why would anyone like that, right? Why would you want to limit yourself unnecessarily? And I think I think the type of work that you're doing is super interesting because you can see how certainly we don't want crypto to be a wild west to the point that I think no matter how libertarian you may be, I think when you hear about people really getting hurt and that being enabled through crypto, I think for most people that gets to the point where you say, hey, maybe we need to keep people safe at the very least, right? And there's certainly a spectrum there from how much control should be present, but yeah, I mean, I don't see why anyone would want to volunteer to limit what you could do with your crypto, right? I mean, at some point, it really defeats the whole purpose of self-custody and being able to manage your own assets, right? Having that freedom and independence.
No, you're absolutely right, and the sad reality is the people that are losing money today are the people that most probably can't afford to lose it, right? But they're fed all this, misinformation about the different tokens, right? They're being scammed into buying into projects, or they're chasing abnormal returns that, if you really think about it, it's just not sustainable, right? But at the same time, not many people are asking the right questions, right? I've had people before who participate in DeFi products, right? And they're like, look at this, it gives me 86,000 APY, right? And I'm like, okay, how are they doing that? And they're like, I don't care.
Yeah.
Right. And what are you getting in return? I don't know, something that I can sell for money.
Yeah. It doesn't add up. Okay, I guess you know what? I realized that we talked about FATF about a bunch. Can you tell us what is FATF?
FATF stands for Financial Action Task Force. They are the global regulatory body that introduces standards around anti-money laundering, right? And every country naturally wants to be a FATF member, because if you're not a FATF member or you're on FATF's gray or black list, what that means is that you're a country that is seen to have weak AML standards, and how that translate into the impact is banks won't want to remit money to your country.
Got it. Okay, interesting. Yeah, I know. I've been learning more about this stuff in the last couple of years than I knew before, as you can imagine. It's super interesting space. Ian, thank you so much for being with us.
No, my pleasure.
Okay. I think we're gonna have to have you back sometime. Got to have a compliance guy around, so this was really helpful.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good one.